So, at various times I've been targeted by the DEA, ICE, CIA, FBI, U.S. Marshals, federal judges, state court judges. There's a long litany and list of people who've come at me for one reason or another because of a political case that I've had. And so in that context, when people ask me first, are you nervous about going after the Fed? It's like, well, they just got to get into a long line of people who have wanted to see bad things happen to me. And if I always tell me, if it really hits the fan, I'll just say, hey, this was all George's idea. I'm just a lawyer.
Welcome back to Wall Street Silver. We have a very special guest today. We have Mr. Robert Barnes. Mr. Robert Barnes is well known for his legal career. He is currently representing George Gammon in a lawsuit against the Federal Reserve. And we have invited him on here to share with us an update on how that lawsuit's going and talking about all sorts of legal issues around that. Mr. Barnes, thank you very much for joining us.
Glad to be here.
I saw an interview with you and George Gammon about a month ago. At that time, you were kind of in the FOIA stage of this lawsuit, and you seemed like you were kind of hunting around for what angle to sue. Have you progressed from that point? Are you kind of working on a hunch as to where you're going to go with it?
So we're still in the FOIA stage. I anticipate the FOIA stage will take up the rest of the summer, both in the sense of waiting for their responses and in our follow-ups. And then I anticipate either we will get answers by fall or we will get lawsuits by fall. So that's basically where we are timing-wise.
So how much of the history of the Federal Reserve do you know? I mean, has that kind of like colored your thought process and the constitutionality of the institution itself?
To some degree, yes. In other words, so like some of the things that we're requesting in the FOIA request are information that go all the way back to the foundation and formation of the Fed itself. Also, any documents they have that they may have archived that may predate the Fed, but the Fed may have copies of, including conversations, discussions, meetings that took place between 1908 and 1913, with, highlighting certain individuals and institutions amongst them, but not exclusive to that. Because our goal is to look at everything the Fed has that could be very revelatory about the Fed's own awareness of its legal limitations of its course of actions, and anything that would expose and document that we want, as well as, so we want everything from the past, but also everything for the future. What are their future intentions? What are their conversations, communications, discussions, plans, agenda meeting concerning things like a digital currency, things like global surveillance, things of that nature as well.
How much protections does the Fed have for their communications? Is there certain sort of time frames that they don't have to reveal anything until X number of months or years have passed?
The nice thing is under FOIA, they have very few limitations. So under FOIA, their original position, and FOIA was passed in the early 1970s. It was kind of the reformist movement where there was a public consciousness that there was a kind of a deep state awareness in the early 70s because of the back-to-back assassinations of the Kennedy brothers, the assassination of Martin Luther King, then everything that was going on with Watergate. The public awareness was at a new height, and a lot of reformist elements had its peak of power, and that led to the passing of the Freedom of Information Act and the Privacy Act that gave us a lot of this intel and information. And from that, the only limitations are what the Freedom of Information Act limits, and it has no limits by time. Its limits are only if it's for a law enforcement capacity, sometimes attorney-client privilege, so they may be able to hide some information as work product, but not much, because the Fed is rarely involved in actual legal issues in terms of a lawsuit agenda. So a lot of this stuff, in my view, is not protected under privilege or work product. So in my view, very little. And what happened is in 08, 09, they got sued by Bloomberg and other news organizations that wanted to know about certain specific transactions. The Fed took their position that they had no duty to disclose anything because they were really a private entity. Court said, no, you're wrong. If you're acting in a governmental capacity, all records related to that have to be disclosed. So the Fed is in a position where the only real way they can withhold information from us is to say, we didn't do this in our governmental capacity. Well, that becomes an admission we can use for subsequent separate litigation, because that means that they are, one, not immune from suit because they weren't acting as an agent of the state and are not clothed in sovereign immunity if they were not acting in a governmental capacity. And secondly, it means some of the things they didn't have the legal authority to do in the first place because it was outside their governmental capacity. So we see it as a win-win situation.
Now, is the ultimate goal to get some sort of court ruling that limits the Fed's what seems like right now they have unlimited power, or they think they do? Is the ultimate goal to get some sort of court orders or to more define what the Fed's allowed to do and box them in a bit?
It's a bifurcated agenda. So one is for the court of public opinion, one is for the court of law. And the part of it, this all started when George Gammon came to me and said, is there a way we could audit the Fed legally? Mm-hmm. And so I went back and researched and came back and said, I think there is a way to audit the Fed. We may have to sue the Fed, but the grounds to do so would be to FOIA the Fed. And I said, the goal would be, okay, and we game planned it out. Like, okay, what happens if they do this? What happens if they do that? And my view was, okay, what's our ultimate objective? In the court of public opinion, it's to awaken a lot more people that we have this secretive organization of a private clique of bankers that are determining and dictating and running economic policy for everybody in the world, and that their agenda and their objectives get a lot worse and a lot darker than where they've been. They've induced recessions. They've induced depressions. They've induced bubbles. They can determine whether the dollar sitting in your wallet, whether that you worked for over the last day is worth 70 cents or $1.30. So these are people that control your lives, but still large numbers of the populace don't know how to connect to it or understand it because of this sort of obtruse complexity of arcane financial language. And we want to breach through that in simple terms. And so like people are saying, hey, Barnes, the Fed's going to say, screw you, shove off. The courts are corrupt. You'll never get anything. And I'm like, we still get something, because in that instance, I get to talk to the ordinary bartender and say, you know that there's a secret organization of bankers. You don't have to take my word for it. They wouldn't even disclose any of the records to us. They hid all the records. And that's where most people don't need to understand what the content of those records mean from an economic, financial perspective. All they need to know is there's a bunch of secret bankers who have control over things, who won't give basic information to the citizenry who are entitled to it. That's why, so in our best case scenario, we get tons of damning information that's revelatory about the Fed, that awakens, like, here it is in their own language admitting they couldn't do this or they plan on doing that. And that's why I see it as a win-win in the court of public opinion. The court of law, if we get them to admit they've been doing a lot of things beyond their legal scope, and we'll find contradictory claims about their legal authority, then anybody who's ever been injured or impaired by the Fed, I believe, can then will have a legal basis to sue, saying this was outside their own authority according to their own internal documents and correspondence and communications.
Well, that'll be really interesting. I've been amazed at what they think is within their power. I mean, you even hear the Fed people talking about using Fed policy to affect the climate now. I mean, it's just ridiculous, some of the overreach that they think is within their realm.
I think there's internal documentation about their intention to do not only a digital currency, but for it to be a chip. And that what else will be on that chip is medical records information, vaccine delivery information, the ability to remotely access it. They've been designing chips that have that capacity. You sort of incorporate the biometric testing of what they're doing in India with you just look at anything that Bill Gates has a patent on, and you can find this pattern. And I want to know, what's the Fed's involvement in this? What's the Fed's role in this? What is the Fed planning on this? And I think that could be very revelatory to lots of people.
You know, if you do get in that, I'd like to know, hey, I want to know what their plan is for dealing with the debt. Because a lot of people think there is actually a plan to reset the currency, as in the dollar is just going to be inflated away, debt jubilee, new currency completely. And that's going to just be incredibly destructive to an entire generation of people. And it's already in their plan. And I guarantee you they're discussing it in some of their papers. And so ask for it, please. If you have not already, please ask.
Yeah, we're absolutely. Well, we put together a team of associate lawyers that are familiar in the bank and financial space, with a team of bank auditors, people who that's all they've been doing for 20 years for the most part, is auditing banks. So they understand where records can be, and FOIA experts to know where they may be. Because 3 weeks after we announced this suit, all of a sudden the Fed came out for the first time in 8 years and said, "Oh, we're going to change our FOIA laws to make it harder for you to get our FOIA records." Maybe it's a coincidence. It's 3 weeks after we announced suit, 8 years. But I generally, when they often say that something bad happens, never assume malevolence where incompetence could explain them. But I say, when you're talking about the Fed and the CIA, never infer incompetence where malevolence is a likely explanation. Well, and so they made it a little more, but that's why we put together a team of experts to go at all of this intel and this information, to know where to locate it, to know how to locate it, to know what to request, to make sure we are all through all the little technical loopholes and barriers and hurdles, and we can get around and underneath all of them, so that they don't have any legal excuse to not turn over this information without making admissions that we can use in other litigation.
Are there other angles that you can go at this with, by like maybe the Treasury Department or some other governmental body that's related to the Fed?
Potentially. I mean, people have asked about, we're going to focus on the Fed for now, but our goal ultimately is twofold also after this. Not only the objective of what we obtain in the suit itself, but we want to sort of be the Lewis and Clark, blazing a path to show people all around the world how they can use the same path. So they could basically cut and paste down the road 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years from now. And you could have tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of FOIA requests of the Fed, but not just the Fed, other related organizations, whether it's, any of the financial organizations and other organizations that are kind of in this quasi-private public space. Also, I believe there's local organizations that could apply to under analogous state law, under the Sunshine and Open Records Act request of because this model, this Fed model, you find all over the place at a local, particularly at a local level. You'll find all these private-public hybrid partnership deals where they try to hide information here and get away with this over there, just doing it. And it's they're doing on a small scale what the Fed does every day, to basically ravage people without knowing that they've been ravaged or by whom the culprit is. So yes, there's definitely a way to apply this to a broader context. Our goal is to use the Fed as a template to do it. Also, if you can beat the Fed, you can beat anybody. Mm-hmm. And so that's also the reason to go that route first.
You took on the IRS with the Wesley Snipes case and some others. Do you anticipate this being more difficult?
About co-equal. So, at various times I've been targeted by the DEA, ICE, CIA, FBI, U.S. Marshals, federal judges, state court judges. There's a long litany and list of people who have come at me for one reason or another because of a political case that I've had. And so in that context, when people ask me first, are you nervous about going after the Fed? It's like, well, they just got to get into a long line of people who have wanted to see bad things happen to me. And if it I always tell me, if it really hits the fan, I'll just say, hey, this was all George's idea. I'm just a lawyer.
George will love that.
Yeah, absolutely. Exactly. Well, if they can find him, he'll be in some Ford diesel truck, up somewhere in the mountains before they're able to catch up to him. But so I think that, the goal is, but I'm not worried about it because I've been down this road before. So it's an old familiar path.
Can you state for the record that you are not suicidal, so that if anything happmes, there is a recording?
Well, yeah, that didn't really work for John McAfee. He'd been saying that for 12 years. They still hung him. So I'm a happy-go-lucky individual. So that they're going to have to take me out the old-fashioned way, or as Edwin Edwards put it, they're going to have to catch me in bed with a live boy or a dead girl.
We have his. I'll be there if you disappear through any sort of suspicious circumstances. We will blow the whistle. So you will be avenged, sir. You will be avenged.
Fantastic.
So, Robert, you kicked off your career kind of early when you were at Yale, and you left in protest, and you wrote an op-ed that got some pretty good coverage. Do you do this mostly out of a sense of duty, or do you enjoy it?
Oh yeah, completely. Because we did fundraising for it. The main reason to do fundraising was to cover the whole team's expenses. Mostly, I've donated my time. And we'll probably do some future fundraising in order to give people a template, because I've been trying to convince lawyers out there you can fight these big institutions, and their first response to me is, aside from why in the world do I want to sue that institution, I'll just get crushed, is for the ones who are willing to do it, they say, hey, it costs too much, there's no money, there's nobody that can pay for it. And I want to show, no, we can do what the GameStop Redditors did to the hedge funds. We can do the same thing in the legal world to show you there's a lot of people who are willing to make quiet, anonymous donations to help smart, aggressive lawyers take on and expose the system. And so that's part, but it's been part of my personality since I was knee high to a grasshopper. So it's just in the DNA, as they say.
I would agree with that. Our group, Wall Street Silver, we raised $100,000 just to put up billboards across the country telling people to buy silver, protect yourself from inflation. Literally, 2,600 donations from people who are followers of our community just to put up billboards. So I totally agree. If the cause is right, there are millions of people in this country who will contribute to a GoFundMe, $10, $20, whatever. And collectively, we all add up to a real force. But the cause has to be right, And hell, man, I agree with you. Suing the Fed, that's a worthy cause. That is a worthy cause, sir. And hat tip to you. I appreciate what you're doing. And if you guys need to raise some money in the future to keep it all going, let me know. We've got pretty good size. I'm no George Gammon, but my Twitter's about 1/4 of a George Gammon, just so I'll be happy to help you out. So just let me know.
Yeah, and the goal is to be able to crowdsource this for other future people to do it, to see it, to say, hey, here's the path. So, we're willing to blaze the path. And then I think it's a path that, once we blaze it, a lot of people can follow in those tracks and basically change the world. I always like to say the greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing people he did not exist. Well, the greatest trick the system ever pulled was convincing people they cannot resist. Mm-hmm. And once they learn they can, and they arm together to do so, they can do like a couple of little GameStop Redditors and take down some of the most corrupt, vicious hedge funds in the world.
I want to shift gears just a second here. We're obviously a YouTube channel. Precious metals can get a little controversial politically at some point. So, we always worry about getting censored on some of our videos or whatever. You've defended some people with some pretty well-known free speech cases. Do you see this environment getting worse for content providers like us, or maybe a ray of light in the future?
I see the ray of light is the alternatives being developed, like locals. So that I pitch locals all the time, and people ask me why. They think, "Oh, are you an investor in locals?" I'm like, "No, I'm not an investor in locals, but it's an effective exit ramp to provide meaningful competition to big tech. That's going to be the only means to discipline big tech back into line." Because so you look at what locals does. You can do videos, you can do podcasts, you can create a Facebook community, you can you can now do live streaming and do live chat, you can do direct messaging. But the content creators own the community. They actually own all the content. There's no big tech that owns it. No big tech that can manipulate it. So I think things like that are going to be the key, because right now, until the courts or the politicians wake up, it's very tough to sue any of these people. So I've brought some of those suits. I've got partial remedy and relief for people, but it's very, very hard and a very uphill battle. And so as long as that's the case, what I'm recommending to people is back up go to a place like locals, go to other places, have backups present that can be an effective exit ramp from big tech. And then if big tech gets back into line, you can, hop back on. And continue on. But I think that there's going to be constant hurdle. They're going to accelerate the censorship before they stop it.
So I have, you're somewhat of a constitutional scholar. I'd like to ask you about the definition of money in the Constitution. According to Article 1, Section 10, it states no state shall enter into any treaty, alliance, or confederation, grant letters of marque, coin, money, emit bills of credit, make anything but gold and silver coin, a tender, and payments of debts. Now, I know that applies to the states, but also there was the Coinage Act of
1972.
No, it was
1792.
That defined the U.S. dollar as 371.25 grams of pure silver and 10 U.S. dollars as 247.5 grains of gold. Now, to me, the fiat currency, quantitative easing monopoly money that's out there today is completely different from that. It's not a hard currency. Do you think that our current dollar is even constitutionally legal?
Not in my view. I mean, now that the problem is that ship has sailed from the court's perspective, because dear Justice Marshall wanted to do what he wanted to do, in the sense of, but it was clear at the time of the Constitution, they were debating whether or not to authorize a national bank. And one of the great fears, because people forget we already had a kind of a constitution, it was the Articles of Confederation. This was an attempt to amend that. It ended up being it ended up becoming kind of a coup to replace it. They needed to get enough public support in order to get it through. And it was recognized at the Constitutional Convention that a national bank would doom the Constitution's ability to pass. And if it wasn't explicitly included as an express power, then it meant the federal government did not have that power. So in my view, nothing about the Federal Reserve is constitutional in any respect, and nothing about what we currently do in currency and monetary policy is really constitutional for the most part. Now, the courts just don't care. It's kind of like aspects of the income tax. There's serious aspects of the income tax you can challenge in terms of its extension and application, but the courts just don't care. They're not going to enforce it. But I think from a theoretical perspective, there's definitely limitations. But that's why I'm interested in the Fed suit. I have a hunch, especially if we go back in time, there's some lawyers and some other people who wrote internal memorandums that said, you know what, there's probably a problem here. There's probably a problem here. And that would be an admission and an acknowledgement that there's constitutional constraints on what they're doing.
Well, you said that ship has sailed, but I mean, the Supreme Court has overturned prior decisions in the past, right?
Yes. Okay. I mean, no question. If we get a conscientious Supreme Court, if there were 5 Robert Barneses on the Supreme Court, the Fed would be unconstitutional tomorrow. So the question is whether we can get close to that to achieve that outcome. I have no doubt. At least my view is the Federal Reserve is not constitutional. How they're treating our currency is not constitutional.
I think if we do get to that, you're right. There's already so much ingrained institutionally that it's very tough to overturn that. People just cannot imagine not having a Fed. They cannot imagine not having an income tax. They can't. These are just certain concepts that even if you might be right legally on the letter of the law or the letter of the Constitution, that's just a bridge too far that the Supreme Court or most federal judges are not willing to cross. It's like the reason they don't put J.P. Morgan into jail is, what would that do to the economy if Jamie Dimon was in handcuffs or something? It's just there's certain things they won't do. But I wonder if we reach that point of the currency's just wiped out through this devaluation, whether we might reach that sort of revolutionary moment where the population is just so miserable and so fed up with everything that that's the point where real change happens. And part of what you're doing, sir, is preparing the groundwork for that. And if these concepts are out there and it's fully fleshed out that this is the way it should have been, and what we're dealing with now is a direct result of what those clowns have been doing the past 50 years since 1971 when they left the gold standard, or whatever you want to say is the root cause. But there's a point in the future, I think within our lifetimes, Mr. Barnes, that opportunity might present itself, because what they're doing right now, and I don't know, is that part of your thinking when you do these types of things, laying the groundwork?
Well, absolutely. I see it as germinating the ground so that when the seeds hit, there's rich soil for it to develop in. And I go back to people that were in the 14th or 15th century or 16th century. You could argue some of the people who wrote Shakespeare also were part of this. Back then, if you would have told them we're going to get to a place where people are going to say are going to completely reject the idea of the divine right of kings, that they're going to say no princes and no popes are going to run my life, that the people are going to run it instead. That would be seen as completely insane. There have been thousands of years where nobody had challenged the assumption that some inbred nephew is supposed to rule over the rest of us. Until you have Thomas Paine, the ground had been seeded so well that Thomas Paine's running around in colonial taverns in the 1750s, 1760s. And early 1770s, and he's saying, just look at some of these people's kids. Do you think God picked that kid to rule over us? I mean, and to where it was brilliantly pop. So I see it as the same thing. And look at that, all the work to end the Fed and all the work to expose these banksters running our lives, or from over 90 years. That a lot of people only tuned into in 2008, 2009, 2010, because first they saw, hey, something's going wrong in the banking system. And it led them to people who said, here's the whole problem with the whole system. And then the same with cryptocurrencies. People got interested in Bitcoin, and then they're like, well, what is cryptocurrency really all about? It led them to a lot of the Fed stuff. So you've seen interest explode in just the last decade. And so we just have to lay the groundwork for everybody so that and give them easy talking points so that when the time comes, they're, as they say, it's only to those who will knock that the door will be opened, but we need to make sure there's something there for them when that door is opened.
Well, we really appreciate your time. This has been phenomenal. Hopefully we can get an update once you get your FOIA request. I'm picturing, I've seen some movies where law firms just get these boxes and boxes of information. I think you're either going to wind up with that or you're going to wind up with nothing.
Do you think, I think they're going to just flood you with paper and to try to just bury you or something?
I hope they do, because I do a lot of criminal tax cases, civil tax cases. That's something I'm very, very skilled at handling. I'm guessing it's going to be what somebody told me at a poker game once. It'll be one sentence, and it'll be there's an F and there's a U. That will be probably the first Fed response. So we're going to have to send that letter back to them in kind with a lawsuit if necessary.
Well, sir, thank you very much for giving us this time and giving us an update. And, we're going to be following this closely as precious metals investors. We're obviously very interested in what you're doing. That just fits right in with our audience. And, in the next 3 or 4 months, if there's any sort of progress in the case, we'd love to have you back for a quick little 30-minute update if we can make it in your time.
Oh, absolutely. And I'll be putting up this update, an update on any other suit talking about big tech at our own locals page, which is vivabarneslaw.locals.com.
I will add that in the description, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you.